On June 4, 1943, along Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas, the hand holding the pencil shook just a bit as Uniffizier Vera Burkhardt scribbled entries into his secret journal, phrases that could have landed him in isolation if his fellow officers ever found them. The Americans have to be deceiving us. It's inconceivable for any country to boast such plenty amid a conflict raging on 2 continents. Moments earlier, peering out the railcar's glass, he had seen a sight that upended 3 years' worth of Nazi indoctrination. Bright bulbs glowed from each rural home, every road junction, and all storefronts. A vast array of illuminated points spanned the Texas countryside at 10 p.m., like stars scattered endlessly. Back in Germany, blackout rules had shrouded the Reich in shadows starting in 1940. Prior to the conflict, only about 20% of German countryside properties had access to power. But in this land that Nazi broadcasters had painted as a crumbling, debauched United States, energy surged as freely as a river. Some 1850 troops from Irwin RML's Africa Corps disembarked from the commuter rail, not crammed into livestock transports or cargo haulers, but in comfortable Pullman cars featuring lounges, meals, and berths. Mexia's full community had gathered to observe their entrance. Unbeknownst to the onlookers, this encounter would ignite the deepest mental shift in contemporary POW history, a deliberate unraveling of Nazi beliefs via the raw evidence of U.S. manufacturing might. The equation of Allied triumph was unfolding not through strategic maps, but via output figures that would soon dismantle every notion these fighters held about their foes, their nation, and their mission. The downfall started on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, who had taken over from Rommel, capitulated with roughly 250 to 275,000 troops from Germany and Italy. Reports differed slightly since holdout groups kept yielding across a few days. These were the Wehrmacht's battle-hardened sand warriors, soldiers who had pushed the British toward Egypt and gained Montgomery's reluctant admiration, now abruptly in custody. One such captive was Headman Friedrich Radke, bearer of the Iron Cross First Class, survivor of the French offensive, and twice injured in North Africa. His journal, unearthed years afterward in the National Archives, offered scholars the richest insight into how U.S. imprisonment affected the minds of German captives. The path from loss to awakening commenced at the harbor in Our in Algeria. While Radke and 30,000 fellow POWs lingered in temporary enclosures awaiting vessels, U.S. operations were already eroding their fixed ideas. The American military handled thousands of detainees each day with a level of coordination surpassing the Wehrmacht's best efforts at its zenith, personal IDs snapped and cataloged. Health checks finished, shots given, and Geneva protocols outlined in clear German by U.S. personnel prepped just for such duties. Yet the initial jolt arrived with the meals. Oberleutnant Hans Muir, taken with the 21st Panzer Division, penned a letter to his mother 8 months on. During our stint in the Oruran holding area, as ships delayed, the Yanks provided fare superior to anything our unit had in half a year of arid combat. Fresh white loaves, genuine brew, beef portions morning and evening. We figured it was a stunt, an effort to wow us. It never dawned that this represented their routine field issue. The Liberty vessels set to ferry them over the ocean stood as emblems of Yankee output prowess. The SS Robert E. Peary had come together in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser Yards in Richmond, California, a detail the Germans would have scoffed at as fabricated hype had they heard it. These craft, cranked out at up to 3 daily during peak times, had just offloaded gear for Europe's front lines. Instead of steaming home vacant, they transported up to 30,000 POWs monthly by mid-1943 summer. The fortnight voyage across the Atlantic that July 1943 marked the next stage in ideological breakdown. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann from the 90th Light Division documented it meticulously in missives to relatives, preserved post-release. He observed how the onboard staff discarded daily scraps exceeding what his squad got in end-stage African allotments. U.S. crewmen tossed out half-consumed cuts of steak, intact bread rounds, and vats of soured milk, Zimmermann recounted. They acted casually, without intent to taunt, simply because excess held no value to them. Their stockpiles seemed infinite. The transports evolved into adrift lectures on American dominance. Captives found out their ride was among 2,110 Liberty hulls constructed over the war, each pieced from 250,000 elements sourced across 32 states. From chatty U.S. escorts, they grasped that the power plants had been forged in 3 distinct plants. Factories, each generating 900 horsepower from their cylinders, got put together in harbors that had scarcely been there just 2 years prior. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, from an old Prussian noble lineage that had fought in every German conflict back to Frederick the Great, would reflect in his later memoirs. As our vessel neared the U.S. shoreline, I observed the radar dish spinning atop the bridge. We thought such advanced gear was ours alone, or maybe the British had a few, yet here it was routine on a mere freighter. That's when I began to realize Germany had already been defeated. On August 2, 1943, at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, the initial glimpse of America demolished the final traces of Nazi claims about U.S. manufacturing frailty. The facility covered 4,300 acres, with piers extending for miles and cranes handling loads from scores of vessels at once. In just one day, this single harbor processed more cargo than Hamburg's whole system did over an entire week. Gerrit Jon Weber, a Ruhr factory hand before being drafted, tallied 47 freighters in the midst of being loaded or emptied. He jotted in his hidden journal that every crane hoisted weights that back home would need a dozen laborers and teams of horses. Powered by electricity, they operated fluidly and non-stop, free from the coal fumes that smothered our factory towns. The captives lined up in formation for the walk to the idling trains. En route, they went by vast lots packed with personal vehicles, many owned by the port staff, hundreds in total. In Germany, owning a car was still reserved for the rich or top party members. The Volkswagen, hyped to the public since 1934, stayed a hollow slogan with under one handed out to everyday folks. Yet here, regular workers commuted in their own automobiles. Still, the rail cars themselves caught them utterly off guard. No cattle wagons or those cramped 40 and 8s meant for 40 soldiers or 8 horses that had transported German forces throughout Europe. Instead, these were proper passenger compartments, Pullman sleepers featuring cushioned benches that folded into beds, restaurant cars set with crisp linens and gleaming silverware, lounge cars boasting wide-view panes. Headman Rodka observed, "We climbed aboard as if on vacation, not as captives." The U.S. escorts appeared almost sheepish about the luxury. A staff sergeant even said sorry that the cooling system in our section wasn't running quite right. Air conditioning. That summer, we'd figured such extravagance was exclusive to Hitler's private locomotive. The 3-day rail trip from Norfolk to internment sites in Texas and Oklahoma did more to dismantle Nazi beliefs than any battlefield loss. As the cars chugged across Virginia, the men glued their eyes to the glass, beholding a nation that defied all their indoctrinated notions. Even the tiniest villages glowed with bright lights, places like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro, spots that in Germany might boast just one flickering streetlight, showed off lit storefronts, neon displays, and homes aglow in several windows. The route-skirted plants operating round the clock, their panes shining, employee lots jammed even after dark. Oberg-Reiter Mayer, son of a Hamburg Nazi block chief, penned in a note unearthed in 1987. "We traversed dozens of urban areas that first evening. Each one used more power than the whole of Hamburg." The escorts explained it was everyday life, that U.S. communities had been wired up since the 1920s. I accused him of fibbing. He merely smiled and predicted we'd witness it ourselves. At Roanoke in Virginia, the locomotive paused to take on water and fuel. The detainees stared as rail staff accomplished in half an hour what would have dragged on for double that in Germany. Self-loading coal chutes, electric fillers for water, automated oilers. The whole process highlighted unmatched tech prowess. Even more unsettling was the workers' easy affluence. Their leather footwear alone would set a German worker back 2 months' pay. They swigged Coca-Cola from glass containers and discarded them casually into receptacles. They puffed on smokes non-stop, crushing them midway without a second thought. Failed Webel Hinrich Müller, a pre-war electrician from Siemens, figured the depot where they halted burned through more electricity in an hour than his whole Berlin neighborhood did daily. The extravagance was stunning, he noted. Lights stayed on in deserted structures. Fans whirred in unoccupied spaces. It spoke to the nonchalance of boundless plenty. Once the rails entered Tennessee and Kentucky, the captives confronted America's manufacturing might head-on. Peering out, they saw unbroken stretches of plants, each dwarfing the biggest they'd known in the fatherland. The Alcoa Aluminum Works in Tennessee ran 3 miles beside the waterway, its smelters devouring 175,000 kilo, exceeding the power draw for the full city of Mu. Close to Louisville, the locomotives eased their pace while gliding past the Rubbertown facility, a site where synthetic rubber factories had emerged from barren land in a mere 18 months. 4 enormous operations, each staffing thousands of employees, generated 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber each year. Even though Germany pioneered the technique, it never exceeded 120,000 tons during its peak period. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a specialist from IG Farben, grasped the significance right away. During a post-war discussion, he reflected, "Those factories were familiar to me. The distillation towers and catalytic units were plainly visible. Everyone surpassed our own constructions in sophistication, and 4 stood right there in that spot alone." They mentioned that dozens of others dotted the nation. The rail cars moved beyond Detroit, revealing Ford's Willow Run facility from a great distance. This vast complex, erected in only 9 months, churned out a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. During its height, 42,000 laborers put together bombers using 150,000 components supplied by 1,500 vendors. Spanning 2.5 million square feet, the site drew more power than the whole German metropolis of Cologne. Hermann Verli, a downed Luftwaffe aviator from the skies over Tunisia, peered out intently as they went by. From the tracks, he spotted 17 B-24s at different assembly phases. We'd heard U.S. aircraft were subpar, slapped together quickly, prone to disintegrating in battle, yet the meticulous production lines and solid build quality were evident. These weren't second-rate machines. They were just manufactured at speeds beyond our wildest expectations. As the transports ventured further into the heartland, the shattering of Nazi illusions grew ever more profound. In St. Louis, they traversed the Mississippi via the Eads Bridge, with cargo vessels below hauling more grain than Germany's full 1942 yield. Along the shorelines, immense silos loomed, each capable of storing sufficient wheat to sustain a German town for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, raised on a Bavarian farm, noted in his journal, "The U.S. moves provisions like we move munitions, in vast amounts, untroubled by waste. A lone barge got loaded with wheat that could nourish my whole hamlet for 5 years while I observed. The operator munched a sandwich boasting a slice of meat far thicker than our ration for a week." At Kansas City, the journey halted near an expansive livestock yard packed with tens of thousands of steers awaiting processing. The aroma from the meatpacking operations permeated the surroundings for miles. POWs who had scraped by on 200 grams of meat weekly in Africa, if fortunate, stared as American staff devoured beef-laden subs on break. "They consumed meat the way we did bread," jotted Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "Actually, no, they devoured meat as we longed to devour bread." The overseer grabbed hamburgers from a nearby vendor, layers of meat, cheese, and veggies on soft rolls for just 15 cents apiece. He ordered 20 on a whim, settling the tab with $1. Nothing extravagant here. This was everyday sustenance for them. Reaching the detention sites delivered yet another blow to their preconceptions. Camp Hearn in Texas, assembled in a swift 4 months, accommodated 3,000 to 4,800 captives in quarters superior to many of their pre-war civilian homes. Barracks of sturdy wood featured electric illumination, indoor plumbing, steaming baths, and radiant heating. Each structure incorporated more timber than some entire German hamlets owned. The on-site clinic left the POW medics in awe. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, lead physician of the 164th Infantry Division, encountered a setup outpacing most hospitals back home, equipped with X-ray devices, operating tools, and drug stockpiles absent in Germany since 1941. All routine for faux detainees. Penicillin was available, Dr. Bauer attested afterward, this wondrous remedy we'd only caught whispers of. They dispensed it liberally, even for slight ailments. Meanwhile, our troops perished, lacking simple sulfa treatments, yet the Americans shared their cutting-edge cures without a second thought. The mess hall served as yet another lesson in Yankee abundance. Detainees on kitchen detail uncovered massive chillers, powered blenders, mechanical washers, and stoves capable of feeding 5,000 at once. Rations daily brought fresh dairy, eggs, protein, produce, and loaves of white bread, volumes unseen by ordinary Germans since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a Munich restaurateur, recorded, "We discarded more edibles today than my household glimpsed in 3 years. Not ruined items, just extras. Rules demand cooking 10% beyond requirements to guarantee complete shares for all. The leftovers get tossed. Tears came as I dumped flawless loaves in the bin." By September 1943, U.S. farm and industry labor gaps prompted the use of POWs in crops and plants across the United States. This choice, forced by circumstances, ended up undermining Nazi beliefs more effectively than any campaign of persuasion ever could. Batches of captives were transported each day by truck to labor locations, moving freely through the core of America without coverings over their eyes or limited paths. They observed it all. The vast expanses of maize and grain crops, the plants operating around the clock, the stores stocked with merchandise, the lots packed with vehicles, the homes equipped with cooling units and broadcast receivers. Near Houston, at a cotton processing facility, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang observed one device handling more raw material in 60 minutes than his whole community back home could manage in 30 days with age-old techniques. That equipment drew energy from the Colorado River Authority, a key element in an initiative that electrified 90% of Texas rural properties by 1943. The landowner running the operation was ordinary, Lang noted, just a regular agriculturist, no elite or political affiliate. Still, he enjoyed electric service, flowing water, a pickup, an automobile, and farming machinery. His employees, among them African Americans, enjoyed midday meals from containers offering greater portions than what laborers in Germany got over 7 days. And this was typical. Each property we drove by looked identical. In Nebraska, the detainees toiled in beet fields for sugar, encountering farming automation that was beyond belief. They discovered that one harvesting machine alone could replace the efforts of 100 individuals. The plots extended endlessly to the skyline, every section bigger than whole districts in Germany. Local growers chatted offhandedly about output levels that sounded like dreams in their homeland, 60 bushels of grain per acre versus just 30 on Germany's prime soil. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, laboring on a spread outside Scottsbluff, recorded, "The landowner's kid, only 16 years old, operated a machine valued higher than all my dad's lifelong earnings." When I brought this up, the youth chuckled, claiming it wasn't even top quality. His parent anticipated a fresh version from John Deere that promised superior performance. The harshest realizations struck those captives assigned close to or inside U.S. manufacturing sites. Although Geneva Convention guidelines barred involvement in outright military manufacturing, POWs could contribute to sectors that released U.S. personnel for combat roles. This loophole enabled countless Germans to experience American manufacturing prowess up close. In a Campbell's soup plant located in New Jersey, inmates viewed assembly lines that handled more tomatoes daily than typical German facilities processed over 30 days. The site ran with a minimal staff of females and older males, since the bulk of able-bodied men served in the armed forces. Nevertheless, output surpassed pre-war figures. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had experience in a German processing facility prior to the conflict, detailed the scene. Operations were fully mechanized. Powered transport belts, self-filling devices, vapor-based processors managing scores of containers at once. A single senior female oversaw panels controlling tasks that demanded 50 staff in Germany. She handled it all while tuning into broadcasts and sipping Java. Close to Detroit, inmates offloading fuel at an energy facility caught sights of the auto sector's shift to wartime output. The River Rouge site, in plain view over the waterway, utilized 100,000 personnel to build off-road vehicles, plane motors, and armored units. That complex required 1.5 million kilowatts of power each day, exceeding the total for Hamburg as a whole. We spotted the vehicle areas, penned Obergefreiter Franz Kellner. Myriad automobiles owned by the staff. Back in Germany, such ownership was rare even among superiors. Yet here, assembly line employees commuted by car. The overseer mentioned that numerous staff had a pair of vehicles, one for the job, another for home life. We figured he was jesting with us. By the close of 1943's cold months, the combined effect of these sightings had triggered what U.S. intelligence labeled an ideological breakdown condition in the detainees. The Covert Initiative for Reshaping Views, managed by the Provost Marshal General's Special Unit, tracked rising requests from inmates for U.S. publications, literature, and learning resources. Major Paul Noel, part of the oversight group, noted in late 1943, "Inmates stop debating when presented with output data. They've witnessed far too much. The staunchest ideologues have grown subdued. They retain allegiance to their homeland, but cease discussing triumph. Plenty now voice doubts about the narratives they heard regarding America." Publications created by the captives at the camps started mirroring this shift. The Herald, issued at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, evolved from bold patriotic stances to explorations of democratic principles, market structures, and rebuilding after the war. Its creators, vetted non-Nazi inmates, noticed growing interest from readers. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, taken with the 10th Panzer Division, composed in a message that cleared U.S. review. They claimed America was a hybrid society, frail and fractured, under Jewish control and devoid of any real fighting ability. But every single day I've spent in this country proves the exact reverse. This place stands as the world's most disciplined, cohesive, and formidable society. We've been fed nothing but myths by a bunch of crooks. The sharpest strike against Nazi beliefs emerged from a surprising angle. How Italian captives were handled following Italy's capitulation in September 1943. Those Italian PS who chose to collaborate got organized into service groups with improved living conditions, higher wages, and greater liberties. German captives observed their ex-partners laboring side by side with U.S. troops, dining at U.S. eateries, and occasionally even courting American ladies. Hedman Friedrich Schultz noted, "The Italians turned on us, but they're getting far better treatment than we ever gave them back when they were our partners. They labor without restrictions, make decent cash, and ship goods back home. The Americans harbor no resentment toward them. This democracy we've been trained to scorn seems more upright than our setup ever was." The holiday season of Christmas 1943 delivered the deepest mental jolt. U.S. groups, religious bodies, and community outfits dispatched 500,000 holiday parcels to German PS, foes who just months before had sought to eliminate American fighters. Inside each box were smokes, sweets, personal care items, and recreational stuff. Neighborhoods extended invites to Yuletide meals for the captives, even if rules barred most from joining. Over at Camp Hearn in Texas, the nearby Methodist choir sang German holiday songs for the inmates. Ladies from Hearn contributed baked treats like cookies and cakes made at home. The local Boy Scouts brought over crafted greeting cards. Such compassion for adversaries demolished the last traces of Nazi racial doctrines. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, who'd lost his sibling in the Hamburg air raids, observed, "They recognize us as their foes. Plenty have family members battling our forces. Still, they extend true Christian compassion, not some scripted ploy, but real warmth. What sort of folks handle enemies like this? Just those utterly confident in their triumph and steadfast in their strength." The holiday banquet itself was beyond belief. Roasted turkey, cured ham, creamy potatoes, rich sauce, fresh veggies, assorted pastries, and frozen desserts. Amounts of provisions unseen in Germany since prior to the Great War. The inmates stuffed themselves to discomfort, baffled by such abundance poured onto opponents. "We dined like royalty," jotted Feldwebel Hansa, "finer than what German officers consume, superior to the feasts of regime bigwigs." And it wasn't exceptional either. The overseers explained this as a standard U.S. holiday spread, one that every American household was enjoying too. If they nourish captives at this level, imagine the rations for their own troops. Come early 1944, more than 40,000 German prisoners had signed up for learning initiatives. They delved into English language, U.S. past, math, and scientific fields. The University of Chicago offered remote study options. Stanford University dispatched educators to discuss governance and financial systems. The eagerness for learning knew no bounds. Detainees who'd heard tales of U.S. residents as uncultured savages encountered vast book collections, institutions open to every background, and groundbreaking research dominating globally. They perused U.S. dailies without limits, weighing diverse opinions, a luxury non-existent under the Nazi regime. Hamann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a drafted expert from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Physics, joined sessions on nuclear studies at Camp Shelby. He reflected afterward. U.S. academics, among them Jewish escapees from our homeland, instructed us sans bitterness. They portrayed knowledge as a shared global asset for humankind. Their advancements outpaced ours by years, yet they imparted insights to adversaries. Such open-heartedness baffled those molded by Nazi thinking. Camp screening rooms featured U.S. movies, not a agitprop, but everyday studio releases. Inmates viewed Gone with the Wind, struck by its portrayal of U.S. setbacks and resurgence that echoed their circumstances. They caught the grapes of wrath, stunned that Americans would air such unflattering introspection to foes. They conceal zilch, penned Lieutenant Joseph Kramer. They expose their issues, shortcomings, and disputes, but this candor fortifies them rather than undermining. Back home, airing such views would spell execution. Here, it's seen as civic duty. As spring 1944 arrived, broadened work schemes for prisoners coincided with peak U.S. output. German PSWs toiled in processing facilities, textile operations, and assembly sites, beholding the sheer scale of American manufacturing power. The figures painted an undeniable picture, impervious to any spin. In the Higgins Boat Factory of New Orleans, inmates handled steel shipments destined for D-Day invasion vessels. They observed crews putting together 700 craft monthly, each demanding 20,000 components. The site employed 20,000 staff with thousands of females handling heavy lifts, fusing frames and overseeing assembly. Stabsfeld-Weibel. Kurt Zimmerman recorded, "Females tackling male roles, African Americans managing intricate devices, youths handling boring tools. Everything we'd been instructed was unthinkable in a democratic society. But manufacturing never halted. Operations ran in 3 shifts around the clock, every day of the week. They churned out more vessels in a single month than the whole U.S. Navy constructed over a full year." At the Republic Steel facility in Ohio, captives observed the daily output of 10,000 tons of steel. The furnaces blazed non-stop, fueled by non-stop rail shipments of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The magnitude left Germans baffled. Just this one factory generated more steel than the entire Ruhr region managed at its height. "I labored at Crook prior to the conflict," noted Oberreiter Paul Hartmann. "I believed I grasped factory output, yet this surpassed all expectations. They squandered more metal in runoff than we ever managed to forge." Employees griped about extra hours, even as they generated volumes impossible for us with forced workers on extended schedules. The 1944 summer crop yield delivered the ultimate blow to Nazi claims of U.S. frailty. Captives toiled throughout the Midwest, encountering farm yields sufficient to nourish the planet. In Kansas, they observed grain reaping where individual operations yielded more wheat than whole German districts. Harvesters glided over vast expanses like vessels on a golden sea, each covering 100 acres daily. The silos they loaded could store more wheat than Germany brought in annually. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a landowner from East Prussia, remarked that a single U.S. farmer equipped with machines accomplished the labor of 100 in Germany. They displayed overhead images of the wheat expanses, thousands of square miles under cultivation. They could forfeit half their yield and still outproduce all of Europe together. In California's Central Valley, detainees gathered produce from groves extending to the skyline. They saw flawless fruit tossed aside for slight flaws, items that would have been prized back home in Germany. Sometimes whole yields got turned into the soil to prop up costs, an idea that shattered the psyche of inmates from famine-stricken Germany. They ruined provisions to steady market values, penned Gerhard Otto Schultz, piles of oranges shoved into trenches by bulldozers simply because there was excess. We pleaded to ship them to Germany for our loved ones. The overseers showed understanding, but stated it couldn't be done. Such excess served as tactical evidence of boundless supplies. On June 6, 1944, reports of the Normandy landing hit the enclosures, triggering the ultimate ideological downfall for German detainees. The operation's scope, 6,000 vessels, 11,000 planes, 150,000 troops in the initial assault, highlighted U.S. logistical prowess far exceeding Nazi fantasies. Inmates at Camp Shelby viewed invasion footage shortly after. They witnessed the ceaseless armadas of ships, the man-made ports, the logistics chain that unloaded 15,000 tons each day right onto exposed shores. They observed their country being overwhelmed by the very country their leaders had dismissed as too feeble for battle. Our Friedrich von Tauben reflected, "At that point, we realized all was finished, not merely the conflict, but the whole Nazi endeavor. We had pitted ourselves against the planet's top manufacturing force using myths and ethnic delusions. We deployed steeds versus their vehicles, muskets against their rapid-fire arms, bravery against their endless supplies." During their detention, German captives encountered an element that undermined Nazi doctrine even more than sheer riches: the American sense of compassion. Contrary to indoctrination portraying U.S. citizens as soft and overly emotional, POWs found a society so assured in its might that it extended kindness. When Gerrit Hans Miller learned of his child's death in the Hamburg raids, the U.S. base leader handed over the Red Cross notice in person and expressed sympathy. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher got a letter from his spouse about hardships feeding their kids, U.S. religious organizations dispatched relief parcels to her in Germany, to civilians of an adversary that America was bombing at the time. They distinguished ordinary Germans from the Nazi leadership, observed Hedman Otto. They insisted they targeted Hitler, not the German populace. This separation, dismissed at first as mere rhetoric, turned out to be authentic. They equipped us to reconstruct Germany post-war, not annihilate it. The healthcare especially influenced the prisoners. German physicians collaborated with U.S. medics, picking up novel methods and handling cutting-edge tools. Detainees underwent surgeries reserved for the upper class back in Germany. Psychological support, rare in the Wehrmacht, got offered to shell-shocked troops. Dr. Friedrich Bauer observed, "They addressed suicide attempts through therapy, not discipline. Inmates suffering collapses got counseling, not abuse. Such compassion for foes exposed a power we had never comprehended, the assurance of real authority." By March 1945, the Covert Reorientation Initiative had yielded striking outcomes. More than 25,000 prisoners had signed up for lessons in democracy. The facility publications ran pieces on representative governance, free markets, along with civil liberties, were key topics in the forums where inmates explored post-war prospects for their homeland. The initiative surpassed initial hopes by a wide margin. Detainees who entered as die-hard supporters of the Nazi regime soon penned papers on rebuilding through democracy. Military leaders bound by pledges to Hitler started outlining ways to adopt U.S. farming techniques in a recovering Germany. One former captive, Aust Hermann Göring, unrelated to the Nazi Reich Marshal, reflected in a 1975 conversation that they essentially served as envoys, spreading democratic values. It happened not via force or indoctrination, but simply by watching it in action. They observed everyday folks thriving more than the old German elite. That vision inspired a desire for similar progress back home. The shift proved so thorough that U.S. officials grew concerned over the inmates' excessive zeal for American customs. A few even sought to remain in the States once the conflict ended. Others wed American ladies they connected with via jail pen pal initiatives. In the ensuing years, thousands made their way to the U.S. as immigrants during the 1950s. The ultimate eye-opener arrived in April 1945. When Allied troops freed the Nazi concentration camps, the grim images were screened for German POWs. At first, numerous denied its authenticity, dismissing it as fabricated tales, yet the proof proved irrefutable. Accounts from U.S. troops, snapshots, film footage, and later correspondence from relatives in Germany all verified the atrocities. The mental toll proved crushing. Individuals who clung to remnants of national pride amid battlefield losses now confronted the utter ethical downfall of their country. The ideals they battled for weren't merely vanquished, they were revealed as profoundly wicked. In a poignant reflection, Hedman Walter Schmidt captured it best. We viewed ourselves as champions of a noble mission. In reality, we served as instruments of thugs. We imagined exporting culture to lesser groups. Instead, we proved to be the savages. The very Americans we labeled feeble and corrupt demonstrated true civility. By May 1945, as hostilities ceased, the German POWs approached homecoming with conflicted feelings. They had encountered a nation that shattered every preconception. Their meals in captivity outshone those from frontline service. Adversaries extended them greater respect than their own regime ever did. The closing phase of detention involved gearing up for life in a ravaged fatherland. Officials offered job skills workshops, farming lessons, and civic education. Inmates gained insights into the upcoming Marshall Plan ahead of its public reveal, grasping that the U.S. aimed to restore rather than retaliate against Germany. One detainee, Ost Friedrich Fonteben, later noted, "They equipped us to revive our land. They shared expertise, insights, and optimism. They reshaped broken troops into prospective builders of society." Such magnanimity from conquerors baffled those molded by the Nazis' vengeful worldview. From 1945 through 1946, American facilities sent back 371,183 German POWs. They stepped into a fractured, ruined, and impoverished nation, yet they carried invaluable assets. Insights into operating a democratic, factory-driven economy. Those German POWs exposed to U.S. abundance unwittingly fueled change in the post-war era. They had beheld manufacturing prowess, crop yields, and egalitarian success. They understood renewal was feasible, having observed a culture that embodied it. Numerous ex-captives ascended to key roles in West Germany's revival. Hans Kroll, once held at Camp Shelby, later served as West Germany's envoy to the United States. Walter Hallstein, an instructor at Camp Koh, rose to lead the European Commission. Rudiger von Mar, confined at Camp Herne, acted as Germany's enduring delegate to the United Nations. Edward Ackermann, from Fort Robinson, spearheaded reforms in German farming. They infused U.S. approaches into local manufacturing, boosted efficiency in agriculture, and imported American civic principles into politics. The post-war boom of the 1950s owed much to wisdom acquired in those U.S. enclosures. In his autobiography, Hans Kroll observed, "We grasped that abundance stemmed from liberty, not domination. We recognized how self-governance generated riches, how variety fostered resilience, and how fair labor practices enhanced output." Those insights, forged in confinement, molded the reborn Germany. Scholars regard the ordeal of German POWs in America as among history's most effective efforts at reshaping mindsets. Devoid of pressure or overt messaging, the raw power of American factories and freedoms turned staunch Nazis into advocates for the future republic. Its triumph hinged on deeds over declarations. Captives witnessed a system humming with top-tier performance while honoring foes humanely. They marveled at output levels that dwarfed German efforts as outdated. They savored a quality of life that unmasked Nazi vows as delusions. Dr. Arnold Kramer, foremost expert on German POWs in the U.S., summed it up. America triumphed in the battle of ideas not via cunning through tangible realities rather than mere words. The message pierced through. Each hearty meal, each glowing bulb, each functional restroom stood as a rebuttal to Nazi ideology. The POWs underwent a shift thanks to affluence. Data backs up this view. Among the 3,183 German POWs detained in the United States, under 1% tried to flee, totaling just 2,222 recorded efforts. Surveys after the war indicated that 95% viewed their handling as favorable or outstanding. Even more striking, Thousands kept up letters with U.S. households for years following the conflict. In 1985, marking the 40th anniversary of the war's conclusion, surviving German POWs gathered in Austin, Texas. More than 500 ex-captives came back to the U.S., often with relatives in tow, to point out the origins of their profound change. Ex-Oberleutnant Hans Vea, once confined at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, and who later resettled as a doctor in Georgetown, Maine, addressed the event. Existence in those facilities marked a huge upgrade for plenty of us raised in unheated apartments back in Germany. We encountered flowing water, heated interiors, and plentiful provisions. Yet beyond the basics, we found respect. Ex-Stabsfeld-Webel Kurt Meir, who toiled on Iowa farms, chimed in. Those landowners regarded us not as foes, but as youths distant from their roots. They offered their dinners, their expertise, occasionally even their dwellings, such kindness from folks whose boys battled our side. That reshaped us for good. During the 1985 Gatherings banquet, ex-Obergefreiter Hermann Goetz, aged 78 at the time, gave the main speech that summed up the core shift. We entered America as adversaries, as followers of Nazism, as adherents to deception. We departed as allies, as supporters of democracy, as individuals exposed to reality. The nation demonstrated that power arises not from domination, but from output, not from animosity, but from variety, not from oppression, but from liberty. We observed the full force of democracy's workshop in action. We beheld growers feeding the globe, laborers crafting triumph's instruments, and residents extending respect to opponents. We grasped that the country's real strength lay not in its explosives or vehicles, but in its boundless talent for innovation and its firm belief in itself. Upon heading back to Germany, we carried a purpose: to construct a civilization that innovates instead of ravages, that thrives via harmony rather than strife. The post-war Germany emerging from ruins drew on insights gained in U.S. detention centers. Those of us who arrived as invaders departed as learners. To America, from your ex-opponents, now companions. Thanks for guiding us toward the path. The hall burst into a prolonged applause. U.S. citizens and Germans mingled, past rivals bonded by acknowledgement of a change once deemed unattainable, back when the initial transports arrived in Texas come June 1943. The scope of the German POW saga in America emerges vividly in raw figures that highlight the venture's vastness and its extraordinary outcomes. Facility setup: more than 500 sites spanning 45 states, sparing only Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 primary locations plus 325 satellite ones. Facilities designed for 250 to 12,000 inmates apiece. Building wrapped up in about 90 days on average per site. Detainee count: 393 German POWs within the broader 425 at 171 Axis POWs. High point in May 1945, roughly 20,000 fresh intakes each month during 1943, rising to 30,000 post D-Day and peaking at 60,000 in the war's closing stages. Workforce impact: 14 million man-days in farming, 100 million board feet of timber handled, 230 million worth of effort in 1940s terms, at 80 cents per day per captive. Inmates eased vital workforce gaps across 46 states. Flight data: merely 2,222 breakout bids from over 370,000 held, a mere 0.6%. Not a single lasting getaway succeeded, vast majority rounded up within a day. No U.S. non-combatants injured by fugitives. Learning initiatives: over 40,000 joined classes, 135 camp publications issued, 30,000 in language lessons, 15,000 in skills training, 8,000 in college-by-mail programs. After war relocation, around 5,000 ex-POWs moved to the U.S. permanently. More than 12,000 sustained family ties via mail. Typical letter exchange lasted 31 years. Numerous revisited as visitors or collaborators. Care evaluation: 95% deemed it solid or superb. 74% felt confinement improved their outlook. 61% showed eagerness for democratic principles. Fewer than 10% clung to fervent Nazi views by 1945. The German POWs immersed in America's manufacturing prowess didn't merely observe events. They evolved because of them. Their detention turned into schooling. Their loss became insight. Their confinement evolved into release from Nazism's mental shackles. Ultimately, the U.S.'s paramount triumph occurred not amid combat, but within the enclosures, where irrefutable proof of democratic abundance achieved what troops failed to: the total reshaping of hostile perspectives. The POWs had shown up convinced. Believing in German dominance and American frailty, they departed with a stark new reality. The sheer scale of U.S. manufacturing prowess wasn't merely dominant. It defied comprehension for those molded by deprivation and oppression. The rail cars that transported them as captives in 1943 transported soldiers of the Third Reich. The vessels that ferried them back to Germany in 1946 bore builders of democratic systems. They had glimpsed the path ahead, and it thrived. Their experiences serve as powerful evidence of a deep-seated reality. The strongest tool in America's weaponry wasn't raw military force, but the undeniable proof of how a liberated society generates plenty. The German POWs were awestruck by U.S. industrial strength, yet in the end, it reshaped their worldview. Within that shift rested the origins of Europe's recovery after the war and the ultimate downfall of the Nazi vision. They made their way back to Germany not merely as vanquished foes, but as observers of the feats possible in open societies. The post-war economic boom that reshaped West Germany during the 1950s rested on groundwork established in U.S. detention facilities, where former adversaries grasped that wealth arose not via domination, but via liberty. Not through ethnic supremacy, but through respect for humanity. Not via authoritarian rule, but via collaborative governance. The German POWs had reached American shores, anticipating a fractured, crumbling country on the brink. What they encountered instead was a titanic force of production with boundless energy and unexpected compassion. They arrived as wartime detainees, but departed as beholders of democracy's armory operating at full capacity. In their wonder at U.S. prosperity germinated the mental groundwork for the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and Germany's democratic revival. They had beheld America, and it altered them irrevocably. Their offspring would mature in a democratic Germany partnered with the United States, a bond forged from the metamorphosis that ignited when 1-850 Africa Corps survivors disembarked a train in Mexia, Texas, and realized all their convictions were misguided. Ultimately, the tale of German POWs in America represents redemption via enlightenment. It demonstrates that the grandest triumphs often emerge not from ruin, but from exhibition, not from indoctrination, but from affluence, not from animosity, but from compassion. The German troops who observed America's manufacturing supremacy unwittingly became envoys of democracy, transporting to their native land the kernels of change that would flourish into one of the most effective rebuilds in history. Their evolution from Nazi fighters to democratic participants endures as one of the most extraordinary shifts in contemporary times, a process achieved not by coercion, but by the irrefutable display of what united free individuals can accomplish. Ultimately, that proved to be America's hidden strength. Beyond outproducing any country in tanks and aircraft, it lay in the power to turn adversaries into allies via the sheer force of precedent. The German POWs stood amazed at America's industrial power, but crucially, it remade them. And through that remaking emerged the bedrock of an improved era.